information for people that are interested in getting involved in what's happening there.
Thank you, Soren.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you for
very
your
much.
time.
And we're going to move on really quickly to our time certain, or a little over time, I apologize, but we're going to move to our 2022 Water Summit, what's happening with the Great Salt Lake and why it matters. We'll turn the time over to Laura Vernon, Utah Department of Natural Resources, Great Salt Lake Coordinator. Did I get that title right? Hey, fabulous. Welcome. Come up and take a seat in the hot seat and pull the microphone very close.
Hi there. Good afternoon. Thank you all for having me. Can you hear me all right out there in here?
Well, just a little closer. There you go.
How about now? Is that better?
Yes.
All right. Thank you. As you just heard, my name is Laura Vernon. I'm the Great Salt Lake Coordinator for the Department of Natural Resources, Division of Forestry, Fire, and State Lands. And one of my roles in this position is to serve as the staff support for the Great Salt Lake Advisory Council, which Dina Blaze from Salt Lake County is a remarkable member of that council. And so I think she was the one that recommended that I come here today to talk about why the Great Salt Lake is so important to all of us living here along its shores. So if you want to move to the next slide, I will roll through them. And I have to throw out a disclaimer for today. I did just get off a plane and I've been in South America for the last little bit. So I'm a little jet lagged. I'm trying to get back into work. And so here we go. I will not ask for a raise of hands because I can't see people in the back. But if you look at these images on the screen, I'm assuming that you all enjoy or may enjoy some or all of these items. And if you do, then you're connected to the Great Salt Lake. If you like to eat shrimp, then your shrimp has eaten the brine shrimp that has come from the Great Salt Lake. So the brine shrimp is harvested on the Great Salt Lake. The cysts are harvested, dried, shipped off, and then they're hatched again and fed to shrimp and baby fish around the United States and around the world. And this is a great source of protein for low-income communities here and around the globe. So brine shrimp is providing food to fish and shrimp around the world. If you like to drink beverages in aluminum cans, your lips have touched a part of the Great Salt Lake because the magnesium in the cans is comes from the Great Salt Lake. 100% of the magnesium in aluminum comes in the U.S. comes from the Great Salt Lake. And so if you sit on a stadium bench or in your car parts, you have a bit of the Great Salt Lake that's sitting underneath you. And then also, if you like to eat almonds when you're hiking on a trail or any other high quality nut, you have the benefits of sulfate of potash, which is harvested from the Great Salt Lake evaporative ponds. So this sulfate of potash is harvested and distributed to growers around the country, and they use it as fertilizer for their high-end crops. Next slide, please. And furthermore, if you enjoy talking on a cell phone or are enjoying the new lithium or electric batteries, you will be happy to know that lithium is being produced right now in the Great Salt Lake for the first time ever. And there are many companies interested in expanding the opportunities to produce lithium on the Great Salt Lake. The two companies that are currently producing lithium right now are doing so in their existing evaporation ponds and waste rock piles. So it's not a significant degradation to the resource. It's they're using the water and the brines that are already there. And so I just want to point out the importance of the Great Salt Lake to those who come in contact with their products every day. And I think that's all of us in this room. Next slide, please. And so we know all of the items that we enjoy from the Great Salt Lake. One of the things I like to point out, and maybe you've heard before, is the economic impact of the Great Salt Lake. Back in 2011, the Great Salt Lake Advisory Council, I think they started the real first aha moment of why the Great Salt Lake is important to Utah. Each year, the lake contributes $1.3 billion annually to the local community and about 7,700 jobs. And that includes recreation, industry, aquaculture, which is the brine shrimp harvest. So the lake is an important economic driver in our community, as well as, next slide, Of course, the ecological significance, there's birds of the Great Salt Lake, lots of birds. 10 million birds visit the lake annually. This is a critical flyway for over 330 species of birds. We have the largest staging concentrations of eared grebes, Wilson phalaropes, snowy plovers, and 80% of Utah's wetlands are found along the Great Salt Lake. As Utah is one of the driest states in the country, the wetlands that surround the lake provide an important cleaning, refueling area for a lot of the water that comes into our to the water body and are incredibly valuable wetlands. I did want to point out, though, that as other lakes in the west dry up because of drought and increased demand, we have less and less areas for these birds to go. So they come to the Great Salt Lake, they eat the brine shrimp, the brine flies, they get fat, and then they move on and fly north or south, depending on which migration. And as other lakes dry up, Great Salt Lake is the largest lake in the Western Hemisphere, and so they need to come here. And this is kind of like the last stop shop for a lot of these birds. So very important that way. Next slide. So what if all these economic and ecological benefits dry up? Many of you are probably here or familiar with the high water years of the 1980s, but it didn't take us long to reach a new historic low. We went from 1986 to 4211 down to, actually the historic low was reached in October of last year, and that was 4191.2. And so we've come up a bit since then, but I just got an email this morning that the predictions are looking like we will set a new historic low and go down about 2 more feet this year. And that's because in great years, the lake, we get about 2 to 3 feet that come into the lake from the Bear, Weber, and Jordan rivers. But then it recedes about 2 feet a year. But this past year, with the horrible drought conditions, the lake only went up 6 inches. And so we're hopeful it will go up more than that this year, but we'll have to wait and see. Next slide. So another study that the council really pushed for, this was back in 2016, looked at, what if we weren't here? How much larger would the Great Salt Lake be? And what the study found was that the Great Salt Lake is down 11 feet because of human consumption. That's because of agricultural, industrial, and urban uses. So it's down 11 feet, and that's about a 48% reduction in volume. And if we continue on this trajectory, using the water how we use it, we'll drop another 8 feet and could expose over 30 more miles of lake bed. So we know what the benefits are of the Great Salt Lake, but what are the costs? Well, for starters, and this is yet again another study that the council commissioned, I think, over the last 5 years, but this one looked at what it's going to cost us if the Great Salt Lake dries up. And number one, we'll have impacts of reduced lake effect snow and rain. And I will talk a bit about this in just a second, but you all know that the Great Salt Lake contributes to the snow in the mountains. It's not a lot. It's like 5 to 8%. And so, but we need, in this day and age, we need every drop we can get. And of course, that decrease in snowfall would equate to a decrease in ski season time, and that could result in a loss of revenue to the state. Increased dust, you'll have, we'll have to instigate mitigation measures, which I'll talk about in a bit, that are incredibly costly as we're trying to prevent dust from blowing around and reaching the urban setting that we're so close to, that's so close to the Great Salt Lake. Also, we'll have reduced lake access. As you all may have seen over the past year, we've had over 100 boats pulled out from the Great Salt Lake Salt Air Marina. There's no recreation really going on there unless it's like paddle boats or, paddle boarding or swimming, but there's not a lot of boating going on. And right now we actually can't even get would be hard pressed to get out any search and rescue boats. And the Great Salt Lake Marina Harbor Master tells me that about every 8 years, on average, there is a plane crash that necessitates search and rescue going out by boat to help with the rescue efforts. And we're due for that right now, but right now we can't get a boat out of the harbor because of the low lake level. And so there is some money in place, and we're looking at dredging that marina so we can get boats out at least for search and rescue. So the cost is, you know, the inability to reach the lake when and where we need to. And the last potential cost is a pretty big one. This is increased salinity. If we increase the salinity of the lake, we decrease the health of the brine shrimp and all of the things that depend on it. And so I can talk about that in just a bit. Next slide. So here's just a bit more detail about the potential costs of a drying Great Salt Lake. It can range anywhere from, I mean, this is depending on how low the lake goes, right? Like if it decreases 5 feet, the cost isn't going to be this much. But if it drops 10 more feet, we could be looking at costs upwards of $1.7 to $2.1 billion annually. And this is a breakdown of all of the different resources that could be impacted. I won't go over them all, hoping to catch you guys up on some time, but it could end up costing us a lot of money. And I think that's really relevant to those cities and counties along the Wasatch Front and those who are hoping to ski more. And another thing I want to highlight is we know about the consequences of drying terminal lakes around the world. The Great Salt Lake commissioned yet another study that looked at this. We looked at about 7 saline lakes, terminal lakes around the world that dried up, and what was the impact. And so we know that the outlook isn't fantastic for these areas. This is the RLC in Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan border. You can see in 1960 how it was a full lake, and in 2009, just a mere sliver of what it was. You can go to the next slide. It was the 4th largest lake in the world at 26,300 square miles. And now I'm not sure of the actual square miles, but I'm not even sure if it's measurable at this point. And Great Salt Lake is granted only 1,700 square miles, but you can see from these pictures what dust storms could be possible. And while this was a pretty remote region, if we go to the next slide, I wanted to talk a little bit about Owens Lake, because I think that's a very relevant environmental catastrophe, I guess I would call it, that happened in California. Owens Lake is above Los Angeles County, and the picture on your left is in 1900, and the picture on the right is in 2016. They depleted the water in Owens Lake to serve the LA County and pretty much dried up the lake, I believe, by 1925. And so they had years of exposed lake bed. This was causing problems. If you go to the next slide. So problematic that the EPA had to step in because they were the largest source of particulate pollution in the United States. And you can see the total suspended particulates in Inyo County, where the lake bed is found, is way above any of the other dust sources in the county. So what happened when the EPA stepped in and said, you need to do something about this? Next slide. Well, by the year 2025, they will have spent $3.6 billion just trying to figure out how to mitigate some of the dust. And they anticipate that the mitigation efforts that they are going to be able to put in place for, maybe it's just a portion of the lake, will cost about $75 million a year. And this has now translated into 1/5 of the water bill for people in LA County. So the taxpayers are ending up paying for a lot of this mitigation. And I think the most shocking thing is this Owens Lake is 1/15 the size of Great Salt Lake. So they've done a lot of different studies out here on the lake of how to keep water or to keep the dust down from, spraying it with chemicals, covering it with a little bit of water, throwing some black plastic balls on it to reduce evaporation, to plant things. But what they found in this area and in other areas is the thing that works best is just to keep the lake bed wet. So, surprise. So anyway, I think I just wanted to highlight that this story I think is really relevant and so close to home. Oh, and I should say that the Owens Lake is not anywhere near, it's near communities. I mean, closer than like the RLC that you saw earlier, but it's not, miles from, or I don't know, a half a mile from some of the communities that we have here along the Wasatch Front. And so while this is even further away from communities, I think it's something that we need to pay close attention to. Next slide, please. So what can be done here at home? I'm sad to say that there's not one answer. There's not a silver bullet here. If there were, I think we'd all be working on that by now. But what I think is going to be is a combination of efforts and a bunch of people pitching in and coming together and realizing what needs to happen, down here in the valley floor, but also up in the watershed. So I can talk a little bit about what's happened in recent years. Conserve, right? That's the most obvious thing that people think about when they think about getting water to the Great Salt Lake. And one of the things that the biggest contributors to the Great Salt Lake is the Bear River. The Bear River contributes 63% of the water to the Great Salt Lake. The Weber and the Jordan are the other two large contributors, along with some groundwater. So people have been asking, well, what if we don't have to develop the Bear River, which I believe in the 1990s, 1994, 96, the Bear River Development Act was passed that mandated that the state take more water from the Bear to give to growing communities. But that was, that was then, and this is now. And so we had had folks look at, if we used a little bit less water, how long could we put off the Bear River Development Project? And then this would lead to, of course, more water going to the Great Salt Lake and less into municipal and industrial development. And so I won't go through the table, but you can just see if we make continuous efforts in conservation, we'll be able to put off the Bear River project to 2065, which is much later than we thought we would need it. I think the original anticipation was that we would need the water by 2010. So we've made a little bit of headway, but we can make more and not need the water from the Bear River development. One more, please. So this is just another way of looking at it. If our per capita water use, gallons per day, is 232, these are the conservation or the conservancy districts that we worked with on this study. And you can see it's obviously, there's a range. Bear River uses a lot more than Jordan Valley down here where it's more urban, but the weighted average is 232 gallons per capita per day. But we need to reduce that by 25% to avoid using Bear River water for development. Next. So during COVID, it was a really busy time for a lot of great minds. We all got together. People are saying, well, what do? We know why, because of all these studies that the Great Salt Lake Advisory Council commissioned. We know what's going to happen if the lake dries up. So how do we stop it from drying up? And like I said, there is no one easy answer, but we convened a group of policy and legal minds to come up with 2 documents. And one of them was called the 12 Water Strategies for Great Salt Lake. And then the other one was based on a House Committee recommendation from Representative Tim Hawks that looked at strategic opportunities to get water to the lake. And you can see here, I won't go through them all, but it's just recognizing that we need, how can we bring water to the lake for the sake of the lake? How can we continue to understand where our water is going in Utah? I think there's room for that. And how do we continue to educate people about the importance of the Great Salt Lake? When the lake hit our historic low this past summer, I was asked to do a news interview, and I did that, and I told my mom what I was doing that day, and she looked at me and she said, I had no idea the Great Salt Lake was in so much trouble. And I thought, well, my own mom doesn't know. I clearly need to communicate with her better about what I do for work, and and that there's room for improvement on the Great Salt Lake. And so the other thing, some of the other things that we can do, I think that Salt Lake County is actually getting involved in, is the increased awareness of water and land use planning. And I'll talk about that in just a second. Next slide, please. So here we are, integrated water and land use planning. This was an effort that was spearheaded because of the HCR 10 report, as a way to get communities to say, okay, if you want to develop, let's say you're not going to develop, or Mr. Smith isn't going to be harvesting these fields of alfalfa anymore. Instead, he wants to subdivide this and put in a townhome development. And how do we ensure that the water that was allocated or the water rights that were previously held are put to good use? Is there enough water to do the proposed development that a community wants to do? And so the Great Salt Lake Advisory Council commissioned the first phase of this integrated water and land use planning. We came up with a community checklist and a self-assessment for local communities. And now we're at the exciting phase where we're getting communities on board. I'm hoping some of the cities within Salt Lake County will be a part of this, but we'll have workshops and technical assistance through the Babbitt Institute that will work with these communities over the period of the next couple of years to make sure that new use is water wise, and that if communities say they are going to do development, do they have enough water to do said development? And if they don't, what are some other options for them? Next slide. All right, so you heard probably during the legislative session, there was so much talk about water. Well, some people say it was the year of water up at the legislature, but I like to say it was the year of Great Salt Lake, because I think there were a lot of tremendous bills passed that support the Great Salt Lake. The first one is an in-stream flow bill by Representative Ferry that will allow Forestry, Fire, and State Lands to hold water rights for the sake of the lake. We currently cannot do that right now. So there's nothing that would allow us to hold on to water, the very water that covers the lake bed that we manage. And so this will allow us to do that. Also kind of in partnership with that is a watershed enhancement program that Speaker Wilson ran. His bill will contribute $40 million to set up a water trust for the Great Salt Lake. And this will help us get these water rights and bring the water to Great Salt Lake. And it will also allow for habitat improvements up in the watershed as well. Great Salt Lake integrated water assessment, as you saw in my little house diagram a bit ago and in my honeycomb, that we need to know more about where the water is going. We have, a general idea, but we also need just a deeper understanding of how all of the water flows together in the Great Salt Lake. And so we're doing a watershed assessment that was passed in HB 429. The state engineer, who's basically the Division of Water Rights, who is responsible for directing the water where it should go in the state. They now have a new deputy director that is will be specifically working on the Great Salt Lake. And then we have some funding going towards some water bird studies on Great Salt Lake. Next. And these are more indirect bills that passed this year. I won't dive into them too much, but I am the first two I'm super excited about. The agricultural water optimization bill, which, if many of you have heard the statistic that 80% of the water used in Utah is used by the agricultural community, let's make some incentives for them to optimize their infrastructure so they can be more water wise upstream, and so more of that water can get to the lake. And then the second one is secondary water meters, let's start, let's have people just understand how much water they're using in communities. In the Weber Basin Water Conservancy District, they installed secondary water meters on some of their homes and the places that were using this water. And they found that without there's no tax structure, rate hike, block incentives or anything, but just knowing how much water these people are using on their secondary water, they decreased their usage by 30%. So if we could get all sorts of people doing that, we could save a lot of water. And then the other one is just something that we're getting a lot of attention or a lot of phone calls about in the Division of Water Resources is the turf removal and turf buyback programs. And then just some other water-wise landscaping amendments. So those are some of the exciting things that I think are happening on Great Salt Lake. It's not, one thing that you can do or that I can do, but I think together, like I said, we need this collaborative effort. We need, Speaker Wilson and Mayor Wilson and all sorts of people coming together to understand the importance of the Great Salt Lake and what it means to all of us. And I think we'll have a better chance of saving the lake if we're all on the same page and we can get behind that. So with that, I'd be happy to take any questions.
Any questions from council? Go ahead, Jim.
Just briefly, if I may. Thank you for a comprehensive symposium on the Great Salt Lake. Now, of course, conserving water just to save the Great Salt Lake is usually important, but it's not the only reason, obviously. And I was interested in the statistics given by the Weber Basin Water Conservancy about if we follow these conservation measures, we can postpone development of the Bear River 40 years. Well, big deal. 40 years is nothing. So what do we do after 40 years? Decide the Great Salt Lake's gone then because we can't feed it through the Bear River anymore? I think we have to really look, and I think you've made this point too, conservation, not just cheerleading about conservation or praying for it, but making it happen through regulatory actions if you need to, is absolutely critical if we're going to deal with our water crisis, not only for the Great Salt Lake, but for the population. And I think that means metering water. The more you use, you're going to pay an onerous amount for it. I think the state legislature got into it this year, and I'm glad they did. But there's a lot, we have to reassess how much is agriculture worth to the state in terms of using 80% of our water. And are they using, I know they're converting, but are they using the most efficient water methods these days? I mean, there's a whole lot of things we need to do out there, and we can't just encourage people. We've got to almost force them. Yeah,
you've hit on all of the big kind of red flag or scary issues that keep me up at night. But I think we have to start somewhere, and here we are, which, we have the secondary water meters to just install, but we haven't done the, rate structure increase yet. But maybe that's where we go when we are looking to postpone the Bear River development 50 years or something. But I think I'm happy for the good start this year, I guess. But I agree with you 100% that so much more can be done and needs to be done if people are going to keep coming in and the climate's going to get drier.
Okay. Go ahead, Richard.
Just following up on what Jim said, I mean, I can't think of a greater environmental disaster looming on the horizon than the drying up of the Great Salt Lake. If the Great Salt Lake goes the way of the SLC, the results will be catastrophic, not only for Salt Lake, but for the Wasatch Front and for Utah. So every conceivable method, means, strategy possible needs to be in play so to make sure this does not happen. And hopefully some climate cycles, because throughout history, wet spells and dry spells go in cycles. And so hopefully that is in our future at some time, but we can't bank on it. And so we must do what we can to save the Great Salt Lake, because the environmental, the quality of life, the impact of the Great Salt Lake becoming the SLC will be catastrophic, and life as we know it will be altered much differently.
Also, what keeps me up at night, thank you for your comment. I think it's really important. Yeah, there is no better cause. And I think the thing is that we know, because of these other drying lakes, we know what the impacts could be. And if we sit by and we don't do anything, shame on us, because we know what the impacts are.
Follow-up question, does the railroad trestle have has it been studied and determined that it does or does not have a negative or neutral impact on the Great Salt Lake?
That's a fascinating question, and I could talk about it forever. What he's referring to is the causeway that separates the Great Salt Lake from the North and the South Arm. And actually, when I first started working on the Great Salt Lake, I was thinking that, people are going to want to blow this thing up and that it shouldn't exist because it's a man-made feature. And then it's a man-made feature in this amazing ecological resource. And but what I've come to learn now, and especially during this time of drought, is that it's pretty advantageous that we have that breach here now. And actually, we're working on, there used to be 2 culverts in the causeway breach that allowed flow between the North and the South Arms. And you want that because you want the more salty North Arm to get into the South Arm to have a healthy brine shrimp population. But now, because the lake is getting so low, the salinity is getting so high, and we don't want the North Arm water coming in. And so if the railroad, the 2 culverts that I talked about, they were plugged by the railroad because they were in danger of failing. And they designed a new bridge, and that new bridge has an adaptive tool in it, basically rocks, that we can manage to stop the flow of North and South. And we're actually looking at that right now because the brine shrimp, the percent of salinity in the Great Salt Lake now is at a level that is too high for the brine shrimp. And so we're very much grateful, I think, at this point today that we have the causeway, so we can stop the flow of some of that North Arm water, because otherwise the lake would be too salty as the lake decreases.
And are there industrial users that affect the level of the Great Salt Lake? MagCorp comes to mind.
Mm-hmm.
On the south would be Morton.
Mm-hmm.
Could you answer to that?
They do have water rights on the Great Salt Lake, and they have been using them. They haven't asked for or increased their water rights, to my knowledge, in decades. I think Compass Minerals was trying to at some point, but now they've figured out ways to line their ponds and be more mindful of how they operate. And so they're now one of the biggest supporters, obviously, because they have a dollar in the fight, right? Like, they want their industry to continue. And so they've stepped up as tremendous partners in helping us. And they're also providing us things that we need on the lake, so.
Okay.
I'll
Yeah,
try
go
to keep it short. I appreciate the presentations. They're informative. I kind of have a couple of thoughts kind of on the good news. I've observed in South Jordan, we've had quite a few alfalfa fields convert to development. And so one of them was like a Sprouts grocer with a big parking lot, retail. And I got to think that area is using far less water than watering alfalfa all day.
Right.
So that's, as I kind of look at our valley, and I think, and all the way along the Wasatch Front, what are we doing with water? On maybe the more negative side, as I actually did this is non-scientific, but I did a Google Maps search of golf courses along the Wasatch Front, and I think we have about 75 between Ogden and Provo, 75 golf courses, and we know those are huge consumers of water. I actually lived in Ohio for a few years, and golf was about twice as expensive in Ohio. And in Utah, we're kind of known for the cheapest golf in the country. You can golf for $20, and a lot of these golf courses, and the county runs a few, just barely break even. And if governments don't come in and do the capital improvements, they hardly break even. So they tend to be a little bit of a drain on our resources in our governments, both city and county, but also on water consumption. And I think if we're going to get serious about water, if we're going to remain in a drought cycle, we may need to look at some of these golf courses.
I like where you're headed. Thank you.
Can I soapbox for 30 seconds, or have you had it with me?
You are welcome to soapbox
All
for
right,
30
well, I just,
seconds,
you know,
but I'm going to time you.
Okay. There is a difference between a cycle and a trend. We can cycle and, there'll be a good snow year, bad snow year, but the trend is down and it's not jumping around. It's getting worse and worse over time. You can have a good year, a bad year, a good year, but it's heading down. That we got to remember. And climate change is a disaster to everything we want to, all the problems we want to solve. And reading in the paper today that China's accenting the building of their coal-fired plants to stimulate their economy is the last thing in the world we need to do. So anyway, there's what we do here is going to be important, but what we do worldwide is going to be more important. We've got to deal with it, and we've got to take it seriously.
I'm in.
And I guess I'll be the last word here for a second. I'm actually going to put this out there to everybody. If you have been to the Great Salt Lake when you were a child, you know what that looked like. You know what it smelled like, what it felt like, what looking at those brine flies everywhere was like, right? Some of us even floated in it, went on boats on it, things like that. If you were to take that same trip today, which most of us have not done, the Great Salt Lake is not active like it used to be. Because of that, it's kind of an out of sight, out of mind. And I think the people of Salt Lake County need to go look. People of Utah need to go and drive past the Great Salt Lake and see what it looks like now. That tells the story more than anything else.
Yeah, 100%. If you go out to the Saltair Marina, I would encourage everyone to go out there and look at what the marina looks like right now. Actually, I would not say right now. I would say in June when those flies that you speak of, when they're gone, but because they can be horrible. But I would encourage you all to go out there. It is wild how much it has changed out there. And
It's not
how-
the same lake.
No.
We ought to
Thank
have,
you.
Yeah.
we ought to have a free Rolling Stones concert at Salt Air and let everybody come out and see what's happening to them.
Exactly. I would do it.
Careful, Jim, your age is showing.
There you go. Thank you
And
so much for
yes,
coming.
if I could just say one thing, I was asked by the Department Public Information Officer, just, as we go through the drought this year, please don't hesitate to reach out to the Department of Natural Resources. We want to make sure that we're all on the same page as far as the messaging that we're getting out and how we reach out to communities and making sure that we all, we want to say the same thing and make sure we're in line and we're working together to reach out to these communities, because just last year with the drought declaration and some of the water heads up, that was given, we saved billions of gallons of water. And I think if we're all on the same page to do more of that this year, that we'll be able to have more of an impact. So please don't hesitate to reach out. I don't know if there's anyone here who has a contact who does a lot of the water messaging, but I'm happy to contact them as well.
Great. We'll make
Thank
sure everybody's hooked up. Appreciate it. All right.